The Robinson Report proves that 50 years ago, the oil industry knew that burning fossil fuels had an effect on global climate.
What did they do when they knew about climate change?
The answer is that they immediately asked Stanford Research Institute to go back and check its work. They didn't like these conclusions, so they said, try again. They tried to deny, and in reporting to the government, they began cherry picking and highlighting only the passages out of this report that talked about the uncertainties, not about the realities. This is a story we'll see over and over again with the oil industry, so that the doubt becomes the message. It's a very effective form of propaganda.
Muffett can prove his claims because he has compared the original and the rewritten versions of the Robinson Report. He also thinks that the findings didn't hit the headlines because the language wasn't clear enough.
One of the reasons so much of this story was hiding in plain sight for so long is that we talk about climate change as climate change. In the 1990s, everyone talked about it as global warming. Before the 1990s, people talked about it as climate change. Before that, it was climatic change. Before that, it was the dilution of radiocarbons in the atmosphere, or the Seuss effect, and the name has changed over and over again. By the time I had learned the language well enough to understand, I had actually found this Brannon paper, the 1957 paper, maybe a year earlier. But it was only after I learned the new language that I could really understand what they were talking about and prove that what they were talking about was climate change.
But when did the oil barons start their cover-up? Muffett believes this goes back to the 1940s, when oil companies commissioned the first studies into how increasing car traffic affects the environment.
I'm thinking this is how it started, and this is why it started. In Los Angeles in the 1940s, as cars were exploding, the automobile economy was exploding, Los Angeles was plagued by smog. And when the people of Los Angeles started looking to oil and gas as the reason for smog, the industry started fighting back. And it was that fighting back that led in December 1946 to the creation of the Smoke and Fumes Committee and to the oil industry's grand strategy to combine science with public relations to constantly delay action on a range of air pollution measures that began with smog but soon expanded to include sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, the main driver of climate change.
The committee's main goal: to prevent possible legal restrictions. As its president, Vance Jenkins, put it clearly in 1954. The worst thing that can happen, in many instances, is the hasty passage of a law or laws for the control of a given air pollution situation. Oil companies designed and funded a research network, including the Stanford Research Institute. Unfavorable reports were rewritten. Even 40 years later, ExxonMobil executives denied the very existence of these studies.
Proponents of the global warming theory say that higher levels of greenhouse gases are causing world temperatures to rise and that burning fossil fuels is the reason. But scientific evidence remains inconclusive as to whether human activities affect the global climate.
The oil industry used their knowledge to sow doubt and prevent legislation against the use of fossil fuels. But was this their only reason for doing secret climate research? We're driving to Pennsylvania to meet a former ExxonMobil employee. For centuries, ships have been built on the banks of the Delaware River. One of them was a special order for ExxonMobil. In 1969, the company turned a 300-meter-long tanker into an icebreaker for a very special trip into the Arctic.
Much of what Exxon did with the voyage, it held in secrecy. This is a company that was very good at controlling what went onto paper. They had every incentive to try and find a route through the sea ice to get that oil to market. Were they also looking at the long-term prospects of a melting Arctic?
The official reason for the voyage was to find out whether a ship that size could travel to the Alaskan oil fields. But Carol Muffett believes that the voyage was a test run to see whether new and faster shipping routes would open up when the Arctic ice melts due to climate change.
The voyage itself was really remarkable. They brought the ship for retrofitting here to Chester, Pennsylvania.
Just here, so across that bridge.
Well, 2 times, because first they cut the ship into 4 pieces and sent it to shipyards across the country so they could rebuild it and retrofit it. And they brought it back to the Sun shipyards and put it back together and then sailed it out under this bridge.
So did ExxonMobil executives know back then that climate change would cause the pack ice to melt? One of the researchers on the SS Manhattan was Edwin Clark. We want to know from him why the supertanker traveled to Alaska. For the first time, Edwin Clark talks about his work and ExxonMobil's motives.
Hello, gentlemen. I'm
Hi.
Ed Clark.
It's nice to meet you, Adam. Carol.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Johan. Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Edwin Clark joins us on a ride to the shipyard where the SS Manhattan was retrofitted in 1969. The place closed down 20 years later.
Well, I can remember the Manhattan sitting between 2 gates of this nature and welders working on each side.
And what was your first impression when you saw it?
It's big, 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 big. And I was very proud to be selected as an ice scientist on it.
The voyage was a success. The SS Manhattan made it through the Northwest Passage, proving that oil could indeed be shipped through the Arctic.
For me, one of the really interesting questions is how much of the possibility of climate change was in the atmosphere, in the lead up to the Manhattan expedition.
I didn't really hear about it until in '69 I went on to work on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And it was a year or 2 after that that we started putting a provision in there for an increase in soil temperatures due to global warming.
Really?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
What, 2 or 3 years after that?
That's really incredible to hear.
Well, back in '69, there were proponents and doubters that it really existed.
Yeah.
And the scientific community was divided on that subject.
But you took into account the risk and started planning for it.
Well, even yes, we did.
We cannot prove that the SS Manhattan was sent through the Arctic because of climate change, but Edwin Clark's statements highlight an interesting fact: that climate change was an issue for ExxonMobil at the time. Clark himself has known about climate change for 47 years. He and other engineers used their knowledge as early as 1970 in the planning and construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Because of the risk of melting permafrost, they designed better ground anchors for the pipeline's pylons. Clark's colleagues were also involved in the construction of oil rigs in the Arctic. Did they, too, apply the secret knowledge about climate change? Searching for further evidence, we find an engineer who designed oil rigs for Shell in the 1960s. He doesn't want us to reveal his identity.
Hello, Robert. Do you hear me? That's a pleasure, and thank you for your time.
No problem. How can I help you?
When did it all start?
Well, Shell sent me to Alaska in '63 to build oil platforms.
Did you ever thought about climate change? Perhaps that there has been a climate change?
Climate change was not really being questioned. It was being accepted as a fact. The question was how quickly it was going to happen, because it had very important influences on the design of the oil rigs. And at that point, we asked ourselves, would the ice be stronger or weaker in the future?
Why did you change plannings of these constructions?
The ice thickness was decreasing. So the decision was made to base the design on the 1960s conditions and not on conditions in the future, as they would be less severe.
So the first platform you designed is still operating?
It is still operating in Cook Inlet.
Incredible.
It is called Platform A.
We want to verify these claims and see the rigs ourselves. From Washington, it's a 9-hour flight to Anchorage, Alaska's largest city. From there, it's a 4-hour drive across the Kenai Peninsula. Oil production started here in 1958. Our calls to the rig's operators go unanswered. So we travel to the oil platform on a fishing boat. Environmental activist Bob Shavelson joins us for the trip. For years, he's been fighting against the pollution caused by these rigs.
So on a clear day here, you would see 13,000 foot, couple large volcanoes right here.
Thank you very much for mentioning that.
Should have been here yesterday. Alaska's on the front lines of rapid climate change. We're seeing impacts here that they're not seen anywhere else in the United States. If you look in the Arctic area, we have our sea ice is diminishing. In a decade or so, there may be no more sea ice in the Arctic. That's an incredible impact. The permafrost that lies under the ground is melting, so infrastructure, roads and houses are falling in. So there's real quantifiable impact from climate change that we're seeing now. It's not something that we're talking theoretically about in the future.
We reach our destination, Platform A, designed for Shell oil. The engineers who built it in the 1960s knew already that the pack ice would be thinner in the future and that their design could be lighter. Robert Ma is a local fisherman whose fishing grounds are located directly in the area where the oil is produced. His niece is helping him prepare his nets.
What's that spill down there?
It's hard to tell. They're not drilling right now, but there's always some pollution coming from the platform.
Yeah, and they're allowed to do that.
They're allowed to do that under a loophole in our federal law, the Clean Water Act. It's the only area in the country where that loophole exists.
That makes you angry, as I see.
Well, it doesn't make any sense, and it's all just about profit. You know, these are our public waterways. In the United States, every American, every Alaskan collectively owns these resources. So these companies are taking something from me and my children when they dump into this water body.
There are now 16 oil drilling platforms in the Cook Inlet.
This past winter, Platform A had a natural gas line leak right in here. And it went on for several months because the company chose not to shut down the leak because they wanted to continue making profits.
They didn't care about the leak?
No.
It was bubbling gas coming up?
Yeah. It was in the newspapers. It was everywhere.
The leak was eventually repaired after 2 months. Local fishermen and the oil industry are often at loggerheads.